Good morning. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all here. It's, I don't know about in your neighborhood, but it's a particularly peaceful day here in Overland. So some of our usual attendees are out working on voter registration in various sites, and we wish them well in their efforts. So today I'd like to just make a few comments about a couple more poems from Saigyo. We talked about two of his poems last time. And as you recall, Saigyo was a poet monk who lived in the 12th century in Japan. And he lived in a time that was at least as tumultuous as our time. Perhaps much more so in that the power of the imperial court was crumbling, partly related to ongoing corruption. And the power vacuum was taken up by what we would call warlords, samurai families that fought amongst themselves to achieve power and control at the time. And I'm sure at that time, the future looked very uncertain. But Saigyo, at 23 years of age, who had actually grown up being trained as a warrior, left his post and shaved his head and took up the robes of a monk, and subsequently spent the rest of his life wandering, teaching, and writing poetry. He taught primarily through the vehicle of his poems. I think in our culture, we tend to make a sharp distinction between the arts and the sciences. We have separate buildings for these. But both endeavors, I think, are investigating relationships in various ways. In science, we tend to investigate the relationships quantitatively. As the saying goes, if it can't be measured, it can't be studied. So there's that investigation of relationships, relating force to acceleration, etc. In the arts, there's also an investigation of relationships, but more particularly those relationships that are evocative or sometimes provocative, dealing with things that perhaps can't be measured. So this first poem that I would like to share is this one. Yoshimo Mountains Down here, it is cascades of water spread with white petals. Up there on the peaks, it starts out running under deep snow. Yoshimo Mountains. Down here, it is cascades of water spread with white petals. Up there on the peaks, it starts out running under deep snow. So Yoshimo Mountains was a site that Saigyo was particularly fond of. These mountains are located in central Japan to the southwest of Tokyo and are particularly well noted for cherry blossoms in the spring and colorful leaves in the fall. So it's, to this day, a frequent place for people to go and enjoy the beauty of nature. And in this poem, Saigyo is talking about the relationship between, well, we can assume that this was in the spring because there are petals, white petals, probably cherry blossom petals in the waters below where he is. And he relates this to the melting of snow high in the mountains. Such that if there were no snow, there would be no running waters and no petals floating on them. And the vegetation below, the cherry trees and other vegetation, all of course depend on the water. And stepping back further, of course, we know, and he knew at the time, that the snow depended on the clouds that dressed the top of the mountains and periodically released snow during the winter to develop the snowpack that led to the running springs as the snow thawed. So among other things, this poem is about cause and effect, which is a central theme of the Buddha's teaching. Now, the Buddha expressed this often in this manner. And this is a quote that appears in various locations throughout the Pali texts. Which is the most simplified version of the concept referred to as dependent origination. When this is, that is. This arising, that arises. When this is not, that is not. This ceasing, that ceases. When this is, that is. This arising, that arises. When this is not, that is not. This ceasing, that ceases. Well, the most well-known application of this principle of cause and effect is what we have recently studied in the Four Noble Truths, the relationship between craving and suffering. The first noble truth having to do with the omnipresence of suffering in human existence, related to birth, old age, sickness, death, etc. And the second noble truth having to do with the cause of suffering, which the Buddha identified as tanha, usually translated as craving or thirst. And the Buddha goes on to talk about how if there's no craving, there's no suffering. Now, this gets a little unclear sometimes. This relationship between craving and suffering, whether craving is a necessary and sufficient cause for suffering. In other words, if there is no craving, is there no suffering at all? Is all suffering due to craving? Or looking at it the other way, in the absence of any craving, would there be no suffering at all? The Buddha takes this stance, or seems to, in the third noble truth, that with the complete cessation of tanha, there is complete cessation of suffering. Well, if any of you have experienced otherwise, let me know, but I think that craving and suffering do tend to persist. They're very persistent. And it's sometimes unclear whether the suffering that we're experiencing is due to any particular craving. Now, craving meaning, if you interpret it as meaning wanting things to be other than the way they are, at least if you can imagine never wanting things to be other than the way they are, perhaps would lead to an absence of suffering. But what would that be like? Being hungry and not wanting to be other than hungry, having perhaps a loved one that's hungry and not wanting him or her to be other than hungry. Being sick and not wanting to be other than sick. Witnessing injustice and not wanting it to be otherwise. So it gets complicated. And ultimately, I don't think that these speculations are potentially all that important in applying the Buddha's teachings. It is important to appreciate the relationship between our distress and our wanting things to be other than the way they are. But completely quelling all wanting things to be other than the way they are could lead to a kind of lifeless passivity. That is certainly not the way the Buddha lived his life. He lived his life wandering day to day, interacting with people, trying to use his verbal talents to help relieve the suffering of others. His verbal talents and his mere presence. So over time, in Buddhist literature and Buddhist thought, the paradigm of the bodhisattva developed and was elaborated upon. The bodhisattva who is dedicated to relieving the suffering of others. And we have many examples of bodhisattvas. We have the example of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who died yesterday, or John Lewis, who died not long ago, both of whom dedicated almost all of their energies to relieving the suffering of others through working for civil rights and justice. And we have such people as Yo-Yo Ma, who used his talents, his musical talents, to try to build bridges across disparate cultures. And we can all think of many, many other examples of bodhisattvas who are less well known, who perhaps namelessly work on day in and day out, doing what they do to apply skillful means, to apply what resources they have to relieve the suffering of others, and hence themselves. The second poem I would like to share, and we'll spend less time on this, also has to do with cause and effect. Today's Satori means enlightenment or understanding or awakening. Today's Satori, such a change of mind, would, apologize for the misspelling, not exist without my lifelong habit of having my mind immersed in blossoms. Today's Satori, such a change of mind, would not exist without my lifelong habit of having my mind immersed in blossoms. So Saigyo experienced a breakthrough of some sort, a breakthrough in understanding, and we all experience these from time to time, whatever word we apply to them. But he identified that on investigating this, the cause of this breakthrough, of this opening up, of this transformation of his mind, was due to daily immersing himself in blossoms. And we can talk about what he means by blossoms. Blossom is often used as, he might be referring to the lotus flower, for instance, and the lotus flower is a symbol for the Buddha, the Buddha's teachings. Saigyo was also interested or intensely moved by natural scenes, and he may have just been referring to that or both. But those lifelong habits which lead to the opening up, the understanding that otherwise could not occur. So I guess I'll just stop there, and with the question of, what are these blossoms, and how can we foster this potential to open up and transform, this Satori. Again, thank you all for being here, and I welcome any comments, any suggestions, whether it has to do with what we talked about or not. Doesn't matter. Just share what's going on with you. Thank you.